fine.
Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Renaissance Executive Forum's Expert Insights. You know, a significant part of our brand promise is to help business leaders evolve by leveraging collective intelligence. And I bet you, if I could see all of you and I asked you, do you agree with that? I mean, do you think that's reasonable? I think you would all nod, right? But what if there was something unconsciously blocking that? Like, most of us don't seek advice or reach out to others for help that easily, do we? In part, it's because we're conditioned to see life as an individual endeavor rather than a team sport, or because we believe that asking for help makes us look weak or incapable. We regard self-help as buy yourself help. No. Newsflash. No one in the history of the world has ever achieved any level of success or happiness by themselves only. I didn't write that. Our author and speaker today, Leo Bottary, uses that to introduce the value of his second book, What Anyone Can Do. Our title today is What Any Business Leader Can Do. And I know in just a little bit, Leo is going to give us a way of recognizing when we have that in the way and what the real power of putting our attention on that solution is. But let me introduce you to Leo first. Leo is the founder and managing partner of Peernovations and co-founder of One Advantage. Leo is an award-winning author of not just one book, but 3 books. His latest book is What Peer Advisory Groups Can Teach Us About Building High-Performing Teams. He's also a keynote speaker, podcaster, workshop facilitator, advisory board member, and an opinion columnist for CEO World magazine, as well as an adjunct professor at Rutgers University. I'd like you all to, in your own way right now, energetically, welcome Leo. Leo, we really look forward to this session today. And oh, by the way, everyone, we'll do it just as we always do. Leo will present. You can put your questions and comments in the comments section as we go so that we make sure that we can either address them along the way or toward the end. Thank you. So Leo, please take us.
John, it is so exciting to be here today to talk about something that I am so passionate about. And it was great that you talked about this idea of asking for help, and oftentimes how people see it as a sign of weakness, when in fact it's a real act of resourcefulness. And one of the reasons that I am so passionate about this entire subject is I really believe in the power of we. I believe in the power of us. And without further ado, let me go ahead and just share screen here for a moment. We can get started. And there we have it. So hopefully everybody can see what's on the screen here. I think sometimes there can be a little bit of a delay, but we've got the title slide here. And as John had mentioned, it's what any business leader can do. And let me start by just saying that, individually we are one drop and together we are an ocean. Now, while that may sound like a very lofty line in many respects, I think time and time again, we see it's true. When we enlist and engage the support of others around us, we are capable of extraordinary things. And we're going to spend some time talking about that today through frameworks, through story, and through some tools that you can use for yourself going forward. So let's give some context to this. And I don't really want to make this about the books so much, but I do really want to set the stage for where this work all comes from and why it was really put together. So the first book is The Power of Peers, How the Company You Keep Drives Leadership, Growth, and Success. We'll talk a little bit about kind of where that came from and how essentially it spawned kind of 2 different directions after that book was done. One direction was this idea of peernovation, right? The notion that peer advisory groups and high performing ones, especially what they do so brilliantly, can be applied to high performing teams. But on the other hand, our real focus today is that when we enlist, engage the support of others, we can do some extraordinary things in our own lives as well. And I want to really kind of dive into that today, but we'll kind of cover it all so you get a sense of, again, where this comes from and how it's truly beneficial and relevant to you. So how do you learn and grow? This was a question that I asked CEOs and business leaders when I was at Vistage, and I was heading up corporate communications at the time, and I led a brand refresh of the company back in 2013. So I'm going around the US and I'm kind of looking at this whole thing and not only talking to various chairs and members and all that, but talking to a lot of business leaders, talking to CEOs. And I was asking them, how do you learn? How do you grow? How do you bring new thinking into your companies? And here's what they would tell me. Read books. I have a coach. I hire consultants. We go to events and conferences. And some would suggest that they attend executive development programs at places like Harvard and Stanford. But as you probably see, missing from the list is nobody, and I mean 0. Respondents were talking in terms of making peer advisory groups even part of their consideration set. It wasn't something they were doing now. It wasn't something they had really planned to do. Now, keep in mind, in the lens I had on this, and as you all do, and many of you do, you know how unbelievably powerful these groups are and how effective they are for CEOs and business leaders. But when you think about it, the number of people that could be in a group versus those who are actually in a group is the gap is enormous. And it really kind of struck a chord with me that a lot of us have been in this space for a very long time. And there's something missing here when it comes to trying to bridge that gap. So I ended up having to report out to the board of directors on the brand rollout. And at the very end of the presentation, I basically said this. After talking with people all over the country, I kind of felt like we're trying to sell a Mercedes to someone who doesn't even know what a car is. And it really struck a chord with people there. And I suggested to them, look, I don't think we should write a hardcover brochure about our company and write some kind of book, but I do think we could take a real thought leadership position when it comes to stepping back and looking at this entire category. Not only could we obviously learn something from this, but to be able to look at peer advisory groups here in the US and around the world and what makes them tick, what makes them so incredibly effective. And that's basically what we set out to do. And that's where The Power of Peers came from, which I co-authored with Leon Shapiro at the time. But now, if you're going to try to tell or explain to someone what a car is, where do you start? And basically, we started here. And this is kind of a fun cartoon that I think you might find interesting. What do you want to be when you give up? Right? Here are these two little kids. I almost tend to look at this almost like it were on video, right? Because here's this little girl and she's got this car, and I think she's about to take this kid's building down. But anyway, you know, you start seeing the fact that when we think about our peers, right, and we know that this is something that's been part of our lives for our entire lives, and our peers basically do one of three things. They're either going to lift us up, they're going to hold us at bay, or they're going to drag us down. And I think it's worthwhile to be thinking about, how do I surround myself with the kind of people that will lift me up, that will make me better, and where I can make a contribution to make them better as well. So basically, The Power of Peers really started at the beginning, right? By talking about peer influence. And again, tapping into something people intuitively understand and have experienced their whole lives, which is simply the impact the people who surround us can have in shaping our behavior. Now, of course, in writing this book, and you start getting into all the nuances of this and trying to talk about it from the perspective of kind of peer influence at a higher level, it started to feel really inadequate. It isn't just kind of some, extra version of peer influence, if you will. We had to try to give it language. So one of the things we came up with, essentially, when we looked at what we were talking about, really, was this idea of peer advantage. And this is what happens when we're more selective, strategic, and structured about the people who surround us. It could be everything from how we select our friends and who we kind of hang around with in life, to the peer group we may join, to the people we hire in our companies and who we choose to work with. And it becomes an essential part of kind of trying to take this unbelievably powerful and pervasive peer influence that we know exists everywhere, and try to harness that in a way that can be everyone's benefit. Now, in the book, we basically came up with a couple of models. I want to share two of them here because I do believe they're both relevant to what we're going to talk about later in terms of what any business leader can do. First is this one. When we looked at high-performing peer groups, now keep in mind, when you're looking at different peer groups all over the world, they measure high performance in a different way. Some use net promoter score. Some may use some version of member survey, or maybe they're looking at growth, compound annual growth rate among members over a period of time. No matter how they defined high performing, when we looked at those high performing groups, they tended to have what we identified as a robust learning achieving cycle. And here's what it is here, right? It's learning, sharing, applying, achieving. The idea is simple. We learn better when we learn together, and we know this. Josh Burson actually wrote an article a couple of years ago where he was referencing the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, which is essentially this idea that when we learn something, we don't necessarily hang on to it for long unless we're kind of repeated in the way we engage in it, right? So one of the studies he cited was one where, let's say you have like a 1,000-word magazine article. You read it one time. On average, you'll remember about 28% of it for about 24 to 48 hours. If you read that article a second time, the number climbs to 46%. However, engage one another in a conversation. You get a group where you get into dialogue and grapple with the concepts and share experiences and all that. Now that number climbs to 69%. The thing about peer advisory groups or Renaissance executive forums, for example, is that the members aren't there just to understand content more deeply. What they do also is give one another the confidence, the courage, and the encouragement to apply things they've learned. And then once they do that, and then they start actually achieving things from it, because there could be some trial and error involved here, you start really achieving great results from something you learned. This is something you want to repeat. Now, interestingly enough, this is also incredibly powerful and important to high-performing teams. If you look, and probably an easy example to talk about here, take the best teams in sports. You pick college football, pick women's college basketball, pick, any sport you can think of, where you can think of like the team that's either winning the title or always part of that conversation. Interestingly enough, those teams don't regard winning the title as their goal. They see it as the reward. For what? For doing this, for engaging in that process of learning, sharing, applying, achieving, by going to practice every day, making sure they squeeze every ounce of value possible out of the experience and making sure that they are just getting better every single day. Because they know if they're committed to do that, as long as they make that their goal, they're going to put themselves in a position to actually win titles. Next is we looked at group learning from a standpoint. And by the way, I would regard this as a bit of a miss in the Power of Peers. We kind of referenced it very briefly, but when you get right down to it, you think about the difference between reading a book, for example, and group learning. This to me is where the big difference lies. And it's this idea that we get both intentional and collateral learning out of our group experience. So the intentional learning comes from, let's say we have a speaker who delivers content, could be on finance, organizational culture, leadership, whatever it happens to be. We take that content and we decide that we're going to do something with it. We are intentional about it in terms of how we learn it and maybe how we apply it. Collateral learning, which is something that John Dewey talked about in the 1930s, or kind of accidental learning, is this learning from how we learn. So as we are working with fellow members to help them with challenges and opportunities and all of that, it helps us build muscles around being better listeners, being more present, asking great questions, listening without judgment, doing all of these things that we not only get better at in the course of group meetings, but we now start taking those very skills and bringing them back into our organization so we can model them for others. And it becomes an extremely powerful way that we learn and grow. Now, that being said, as I mentioned, they went kind of two directions with the book, right? Starting with the Power of Peers. Direction number one, although it ended up being in the third book, I'm calling it direction one now because we're going to end up talking about second book. But when it comes to Peernovation, so now I've conducted, if you count Vistage and a whole host of other groups and teams and all that, about 300 plus workshops with various groups and teams. And it became evident in terms of all these workshops that what high performing groups do so brilliantly can be applied to teams inside companies, whether it's cross-functional work teams or department teams, to make them that much more higher performing. And it's really exciting stuff. And I think especially during this time where we have so many companies and teams just trying to figure out as they either remain remote or go for a hybrid or get people back to the office, what is the best way for them to go forward? And I think this is an incredible opportunity to have intentional conversations with one another about what that looks like so you can write your own chapter for the future of work. Second, of course, as we get into Peernovation, just to define this briefly before we move on, it basically combines the word peer, people like me, and innovation, creativity, realize. And occurs when a carefully selected, diverse collection of people who with a common purpose and shared values work together to make each other better and create something larger than themselves. And again, this Peernovation doesn't just have to happen among formal peer groups and teams. This kind of thing can occur in our life if we surround ourselves with the right people. So it's taking peer influence, which is already pervasive, peer advantage about being selective, strategic, and structured. And then the outcome of all of that can be Peernovation, which I think can be rather, amazing and powerful, for each of us. So again, the work evolves in two ways, right? So this time we're going to start talking about what anyone can do. And it's kind of interesting to see and look at where this all started. It basically, in many respects, started with a phone call that I received from a gentleman, Randy Cantrell in Texas. Randy and I didn't know one another at all. He called me cold and basically said, "Hey, I just want you to know that I read The Power of Peers. I love the work. I've been into podcasting for a number of years, and I would love to have you set up a podcast. I don't want any money for it. I don't want to do anything. I just want to be the guy behind the scenes to help you in terms of sharing your message." And I thought, what an incredibly generous act, and a really great thing to do. Of course, I didn't really know anything about podcasting at the time. So it's like, all right, I'll give it a shot. But I will tell you what I did. I named the podcast The Year of the Peer. And part of it was giving myself an exit strategy in many respects. But the bottom line was we set up what is essentially an interview show. And it was interviewing people like the people on the screen, which were some of the interview subjects. Linda Darling Hammond, one of the top education experts in the world from Stanford. J.J. Ramberg, who had one of the longest running business shows in MSNBC. You see Rich Karlgaard, publisher and futurist at Forbes. Jim Kouzes, co-author of probably one of the most seminal books on leadership out there, being The Leadership Challenge. But over the course of 50 weeks in interviewing all these people, sometimes on the podcast and sometimes off the podcast, I would ask them, did you become successful all by yourself? And they would look at me like, you're kidding, right? They would laugh at the idea. There are countless people that help them. And so what was interesting about that, and I think what should be kind of helpful for us to know, is because they realize they'll never be able to repay the people who helped them. What they want to do and what they're very committed to doing is paying it forward. So, as John talked about, at the top of the show, when it comes to asking for help and the importance of doing that, it's really great to know that people like this are really willing to help. They want to help. So many people help them along the way. They are more than happy to pay it forward. So, last thing you want to do is be bashful about reaching out to people who've been really successful at what they do. In the case of the guests that we had, they were in business, media, academia, but just an extraordinary group of people with amazing stories, and to follow their trajectory of how they started and then where they are today is rather incredible. So when we think about what anyone can do, I want to talk a little bit about where this title came from, because it was one of the last things actually that came from this. I was really kind of immersed myself in the work. That was also, by the way, the book was encouraged by a gentleman named Robert H. Thompson, who wrote an amazing book called The Offsite. And, Robert really convinced me that, you've gotten so much out of these interviews. What a great book it could make. And so I started thinking about it, and I'm writing the book, and I didn't really have much of an idea of the title. And one of the things I often do when I'm writing magazine articles or whatever, and I can't think of a great title for it, I kind of dive into the narrative and see if I can extract something out of that. And in this case, I had referenced a book that I had read a long time ago called The Long Run Solution. And it was written by Joe Henderson. And Joe Henderson, former editor of Runner's World, marathoner, and all that, in this book, The Long Run Solution, wrote about really successful people. And he said, whether it's successful people, successful runners, whatever, that most of them don't become that way because they possess superhuman talent, right? They can't leap tall buildings in a single bound. Oftentimes, they simply do the things that anyone can do, but most of us never will. So the premise really of this book and this conversation today is that if we surround ourselves with the right people, if we enlist and engage them in a productive way, they will help us do those little things that anyone can do far more often. So with that, I want to share 3 stories. And there we are. They just came up in the wrong order. Anyway, 3 stories. The first one on the left is my daughter, Taylor. Next is about my dad. The first story really talks about how young we are when the power of peer influence really starts taking place. The one about my dad basically speaks to this idea that, it's never too late to kind of really decide this is what I want to do with my life and how I want to move that forward. And of course, if there's any better example of how we are one drop and together we are an ocean. It's Bruce Cleland. And I want to introduce you to him and share his story. But first, I want to talk about my daughter, Taylor. This is, by the way, not a recent photograph of Taylor. Taylor is 31 years old today. She was 6.5 when this photo was taken, and 4.5 when I picked her up from childcare. It's Halloween night, a little after 5 o'clock. I walk in and says, "Is Taylor ready to go home?" And the woman at the front desk says, "Just a second, the director would like to have a word with you." And I'm like, "Oh, excellent," right? Because if any of you ever picked up your kid from childcare and the director wants to have a word with you at the end of the day, it's not typically great news. However, in this case, the director walks out. She's got this big smile on her face. She said, "I've got to tell you what happened." And so she starts telling me about the fact that they had this little party for the kids. It was about 3 o'clock, and they had crafts and treats and music and all. And someone had decided that they thought it would be a pretty good idea if they had this woman dress up as a witch and come and entertain the little ones. Well, sure enough, the kids gather. The witch walks in the door, and to be kind about it, she was apparently a little too authentic for some of the preschoolers, right? So one of them starts to cry, and then a second, third, fourth, boom, it spreads like wildfire across the room. Teachers are running around, the kids are going crazy, trying to calm everyone down. Apparently, Taylor's watching this whole thing. She runs to the front of the room, she makes herself real big, and she says, "It's okay. She's not real. There's no need to be afraid." And the kids are looking at her and they're looking at one another and they're like, "Oh, I guess. All right." So anyway, they sat down, party goes on, the witch stays, and everything's fine. So of course, as a dad hearing that story, I'm thinking, wow, it's not like I ever sat my 4.5-year-old down and said, "Hey, if the kids in your class ever get upset, step up and be a leader." That was all her. But when I think about this today through the lens that I look at this, it's easy, when we kind of ask ourselves, what was it that caused all that commotion? And oftentimes when I share this story among groups, they'll say, "Well, it was fear, it was the unknown, it was, various things," all true. But at the same time, what someone always kind of suggests is that, it was that first kid who started to cry, who triggers the second, who triggers the third, and then it spreads. Why? Because we look to one another in those moments. We always have, and we continue to do it today. And one of the reasons that I share this story in groups for CEOs and business leaders is that I remind them this happens in your company all the time, minus the screaming and crying, I hope. But the bottom line is that every time you announce a policy change, a new strategy, any kind of a change initiative, it's not as if people take in this information and just go back to their place of work, right? They engage one another in sense-making exercises in much the same way Taylor's classmates did to find out, is this good for us, bad for us, or whatever, right? And it's rather remarkable. And when you think about the fact of what caused it, you also might maybe, give a nod to the fact that even though clearly the teachers would have, restored order eventually, it probably happened a little faster when one of their own says, "I think we're good here. I think we're okay." Now, just so we don't have to rely entirely on my daughter's Halloween story to make that point, the Edelman Trust Barometer, which I hope, if you're familiar with Edelman, and I hope you're familiar with the study, and if you're not, I really highly encourage you to look at this study called the Edelman Trust Barometer. They've been conducting it since 2001 in 28 countries around the world, and it's a study of public trust in government, business, media, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And it is rather remarkable. And in 2019, they actually asked a question. And what they asked the question of employees in the workplace was, what is your top source of workplace information? And the answer, above all the choices they had, was informally among my coworkers. Now think about that for a moment, of all the different sources of information. Now, keep in mind, it may not necessarily have been the first place they heard it, but it is where they find out what it means. And I think it's really something to think about in terms of, as leaders, thinking about not only understanding what's going on in our organization from a vertical perspective, right? And we've got our senior VPs, our directors, managers, and all that. But it's what runs horizontally through that organization that gives that vertical structure strength. Ask any group of CEOs in a room, do you have people in your organization who may not occupy the most senior level positions, but who are very influential with other employees? Every hand in the room will go up. Imagine tapping into those key influencers. Imagine the role they can play in making sure that the next time you have a policy change or a strategic initiative, that it will go that much more effectively when you can truly get everyone aligned and engaged behind it. Second story is about my dad. So my dad, who is now 83 years old, this is a fairly recent picture, actually. It happened from last summer, and we were out playing golf, and he loves to play golf. Um, but back when he was probably between the ages of his early 30s and early 40s, he was a Boston police officer. Left the Boston police force. Really decided, and well, he had had an injury, which fortunately didn't cause him, the ability to live an active life. Um, decided that he was going to change jobs. And of course, he played quite a bit of golf at the time and had played in a tournament where he was in a pro am and they won the tournament that day. So he and the pro, they go out to dinner and he starts talking about the fact that, if I recall correctly, he was going to go in the insurance business. And all of a sudden, the pro says to him, "What are you doing that for?" He said, "Why don't you go into the golf business? Why don't you become a PGA professional?" And he looks at him like, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "No, you could go to the schools, become a Class A PGA professional, and teach and work, in the golf business and do that." And of course, he's kind of thinking, "Wow, when you think about these schools and who does this, it's people in their early 20s typically. He's in his early 40s, but you know what? He realized and recognized that he had plenty of time to do this, and if he did do it." And exactly what happened, he spent about the next 3 or 4 years going to all the schools, do everything he needed to do, got his game to the point where he was able to pass the player ability test. And now all of a sudden in his early 40s, he becomes a Class A PGA professional and teaches golf for the better part of 35 plus years before he retired. It's extraordinary, right? When you think about the fact that in that situation, it was one person that triggered it, but then he surrounded himself with the kind of people that could give them kind of advice, encouragement, um, be an accountability partner, do all the kinds of things that would help him be successful at doing that. And a terrific lesson to me. And I hope for anyone who's on this call who is thinking, I wish I could have done this, or I wish I could try that. I don't care if it's learning a language, playing the piano, or becoming a golf pro. Surround yourself with the right people and you can do some extraordinary things. And I think he's a wonderful example of that. Next, however, I really have to tell you the story of Bruce Cleland. Um, Wrote about Bruce Cleland in the first book, The Power of Peers. Now, in 1986, Bruce and his wife, Izzy, had a 2-year-old daughter named Georgia, who was diagnosed with leukemia. Now, back then, the survival rate was about 55%. And obviously, it just, scared the parents to death about, the possible fate of this baby, essentially. So anyway, they dive into this whole world of blood cancer research and all of that, and of course get her into treatment. And interestingly enough, after 2 years, with the help of countless people, um, the cancer went into remission. And you can imagine the joy and grateful feeling and that the family had, of course, at the time. And now Bruce wants to figure out, how do I kind of return the favor? How do I pay back all of these amazing people who helped? His daughter survived, and he wanted to do something maybe that could help others as well. So what he did was he and basically put together a group of 38 people that decided to run the New York City Marathon and raise money. And they had a few corporate sponsors, but by and large, it was the runner themselves who were like, whether it was per mile or setting up donations or whatever. And they essentially raised $322,000 for running the New York City Marathon. Now, if that wasn't enough, it wasn't just that they did that event, but you're probably familiar with a program called Team in Training, which is essentially, the most successful endurance fundraising program in the world. Back the last time I checked, and it's been a little while, they had about 650,000 participants, and they raised $1.3 billion for blood cancer research. And I can only imagine what those numbers are today. It's a remarkable story, and something which I believe really kind of makes the point that, individually we are one drop, but bring a whole bunch of people together and we can create that ocean. I think when you kind of summarize a lot of this, and as John talked about at the top, none of us does it alone. We learn and do better together. Um, and so I want to talk a little bit about, so what does that look like? How do I assemble my dream team, which is kind of how we referred to it in the book, What Anyone Can Do. And, when you think about it, almost like think about the story I talked about with my dad. He needed different people around him, right? He needed, some people might just offer encouragement. Other would be that person who might call him and say, hey, did you get out in the course and play today? Did you practice today? Did you, finish your homework on whatever class he was working on, right? Others might be giving him technical advice on his game. Others might be connecting him to other people or other resources that could help him do what he needed to do. And then, of course, and I hope this just wasn't one person, I hope it was a whole bunch of folks that served as celebration partners, right? Because anytime you're going after any kind of a long-term goal, it's really all about making sure that you celebrate those small wins along the way, that you keep your not only physical but emotional, enthusiasm, on track and where it needs to be. So if you assemble your dream team, right, if you can get these people that, as I mentioned before, there to lift you up, not to hold you at bay, not to drag you down, but to give you all of the resources you need in order to be successful. Again, they'll help you do those things that anyone can do far more often. Now, that brings us to what I hope is a little tool that you can use. And, we all know, for example, that people have New Year's resolutions, most of which I think on average last 6 weeks if we're lucky, and they don't tend to go beyond that. And again, most of us don't necessarily publicly declare those things and assemble the team of people to actually help us be successful. So left to our own devices, we often just won't do it. But what we can do is this: what anyone can do, and what any business leader can do, is do the following. They can have their people plan, right? And it becomes really simple. First of all, it's kind of reflect and think about what you want. Share those aspirations with others, set some goals, and then start assembling your dream team around some of those areas that I talked about. Create a plan for yourself. Adjust as necessary. Sometimes when we have a plan that we put together, we want it to be a plan that we will do over time. Oftentimes people, especially who are doing exercise programs, for example, will say, hey, I'm going to go and take on this particular workout because they can do it. Well, they probably can do it once. They can probably do it twice, but is it something they want to do every single day? So oftentimes starting out slow, starting out in a way that is realistic for you, that doesn't feel like you're embarking on something that's so onerous that you're never going to continue with it, becomes really important to creating those important habits. So create the plan, adjust as necessary. If it's too difficult, dial it back. If it's too easy, you can start pushing it up. And again, celebrate those small wins. That becomes so important with all of this. And then finally, it's that leverage that dream team. Don't just assemble the dream team and get them involved in the beginning. Keep them engaged and be working together to make sure that you all have that shared responsibility for the result. Pay it forward. Like those people did on the podcast, those incredible leaders who were helped by so many people along the way. But yet we all know the value of what we get when we pay it forward for others. And of course, the value they receive as well. And it kind of keeps us committed to our own goals as well as help others do the same. And finally, it's really about just committing to being your best self every single day. Oftentimes I think rather than be thinking in terms of people holding us accountable, imagine instead to be just accepting personal responsibility for bringing your A game all the time, whether it's in your personal or business life. And I think if we do that, we can do some extraordinary things. Finally, I want to leave you with this quote. Sekou Andrews, who I'm proud to call a friend, who's just a wonderful man, an incredible speaker, by the way, and offered some quotes for the book. And this one in particular I loved. And he said, there is an incredible power that comes from surrounding yourself with communities in which you feel small among them and they look at you like a giant. So I hope going forward that you can start thinking about whether it's about joining a formal peer group, the way you look at the teams that you participate in your companies right now, or thinking about a personal goal you want for yourself and making sure that, you know what, I'm going to enlist and engage the support of others so that I can be more successful, in the hope that also I can help others do the same. So with that, I will stop sharing. and hopefully we will have some awesome questions. So, John,
Leo, there we
here
go.
we are.
Okay. Um, awesome. Awesome material. Very inspiring. And, for me, it's one thing for things to be inspiring. It's another for them to be pragmatic, that I can actually see how I can apply. And so both of those things are there in great measure. Thank you. I kind of with that theme, the story you told about Taylor, and then the Edelman Trust Barometer. What that started me thinking about was, that when the answer to the question that Edelman asks is, what's your source of information within the company? And it's kind of like informal communication. So what normally comes to mind is water cooler talk, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but you added this really subtle piece to it. It isn't just the relaying of information. It's now got a meaning piece to it as well, where the person who's sharing the information likely tells what that means to them. Right?
Yes.
And then that starts this cascading event. I look at it like you talked about Taylor kind of being the response to a triggering event, right? What she did. And that triggering event can be that innocent, right at the water cooler. Hey, did you hear about? And wow, hey, that seems to be this way or that way in terms of meaning. So my question is, preemptively, how can a leader, knowing that this is going to happen, be preemptive about making sure the meaning they want gets assigned, or like that?
Yeah, it's a really great point. One of the things that I do believe strongly is that leaders are 100% responsible for the message being received as intended. And with that, sometimes it's not just only delivering yourself and repeatedly, it's making sure that others can be ambassadors in that conversation. And I think for leaders who, are really interested in getting the kind of alignment and engagement that's necessary for things like this to be successful, it really becomes down to, how do I identify? They know who those key influencers are. How do we bring them in the fold? How do we get their input maybe before the policy change or before the strategy, and get their sense of things? And then how can they serve as ambassadors in those sense-making conversations that eventually are going to take place, whether it's in the water cooler or even in a Zoom call or somewhere else? And I think that becomes really important. It's also critical, I think, to understand context and history around this. Sometimes when companies make big announcements of some initiative that they're real excited about, you'll have an employee think to themselves, hey, we had a big announcement like this a year ago, and then 3 months later, no one was talking about it anymore. So, and they will immediately go to that and they'll think about that, and they don't want to be, Charlie Brown getting the football, pulled out from under them as they go to kick it, right? Yeah. So they start thinking about that, and it becomes really, really important to recognize history, recognize all of that context, understand key influencers, making sure that messages are crafted and delivered with a level of clarity that are going to inspire people to be involved with them. McKinsey basically will say that 2/3 of the time that any kind of a change initiative fails, it's not because it was so bad or so ill-conceived or anything like that. You just don't get the level of alignment necessary in order to make it work. And on the flip side of it, 2/3, failure rate for the exact same reason. So it's it's super important. You can't stress it enough.
Yeah. So it's I think it's part of that last grouping that you gave around prepare, plan, and play. The prepare might be identifying, like you said, those influencers, and preemptively, having that conversation that wins their engagement and acting as an ambassador, like you said. But that last piece you added to it too was, and I can see how this happens so often is we build something up. Maybe we even get that group of advocates together. But if we don't maintain that momentum, which may happen because we just haven't planned, or what are we doing in a month from now, or what are we doing in 3 months from now? So that was another really good piece to add to that. We've got a question from the audience. This is from one of our partners in Iowa, one of our Renaissance Executive Forums partners, Mike Kleiss. Where are some of the most interesting places, settings that you have seen peer groups at work?
So if we're going to talk about a business setting, what I really love to see, and I think it's remarkable when you see them work really well, is when peer groups are working alongside teams inside companies. So with the idea, if you consider the difference between a group and a team, or at least as I defined it this way in Peernovation, a group comes together essentially to benefit the individual members, right? To help make them better leaders or help them do what they need to do in their various departments or whatever in the case of a company. A team comes together for a shared work product or to achieve a collective goal. So groups can be really helpful in helping individual team members be better contributors to their team, right? In business, we don't really have practice. Like every day is game day, right? We show up and we're just in there, and peer groups can serve really as practice fields and be very powerful, I think, at helping teams be that much better when you can get them to engage one another. And by the way, when you consider the learning and development and leadership development spend around the world, which is in the hundreds of billions of dollars, peer groups inside companies that way can serve as a mechanism for taking what a company has already deemed important to teach. Now you've just got to make it important for people to actually learn and apply. Mm-hmm. And this is where peer groups inside companies I find to be incredibly interesting, particularly in the learning and development realm, as a mechanism for doing just that.
Awesome. All right, we have another question from the audience. This is from Mauricio Carrera de la Pena. Excuse me, Mauricio. Says, hello, Leo. On your very last quote, to feel so. This is interesting because I was going to ask you something similar. To feel small among a group requires self-awareness, vulnerability, and be humble and open to learn from others. On the other hand, this often brings a bit of insecurity. In this case, how can we notice that you are seen as a giant? So I think he's talking about that paradox, isn't he?
Yeah. And I think your fellow members have a whole lot to do with that, right? To recognize the value that you bring to the table. I so often see members of groups who underestimate their perspective in terms of what they contribute to any given group. I had a situation one time. It was a group meeting and someone apparently had very poor attendance, and they were talking just a lot about attendance in general. And this person sitting next to me really started getting agitated about it because he thinks he's talking about him, not to mention other things. So he stands up, makes a big speech about the fact that, hey, I paid the dues. I'm here when I can be here. Went on, and finally says, you know what? When I can't make the meeting, I'm the one who loses. And he sat down. So it was this big kind of now what moment, right? So I'm standing there. And so anyway, I look over at the member across because he gave me a gift in what he said right at the very end. And I said, would you mind, we'll call this gentleman Richard, would you mind telling me in 1 minute what's lost when Richard is not at the meeting? And the person was like, wow, when Richard's not here, he brings this very specific perspective to the table that is lost when he's not here. And now a second member weighs in. By the time I got to a third, Richard was welling up in tears. It's the CEO.
Mm.
Richard understood how much he means to his company as CEO, had no idea what he meant to the people in that room, and actually apologized to the people in there and said, I had no idea. He said, I am so sorry. And he said, I'm not going to promise you I can make every meeting, but I'm going to do a whole lot better because now I realize the value that I bring here. And I think when our members show us that we bring that value to the table, even though like all of us around that room, none of us knows everything, right? So we
Right.
are all small in that way, but yet we can feel like giants for the contribution that we do make to others. And I think reinforcing that among one another is very powerful and really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Veronica Hernandez is asking, how can you assure you are choosing the right people for your team?
Excellent question. A great example of this, by the way, can be found in Gino Auriemma, who coaches the University of Connecticut women's basketball team. One of the, obviously, you could argue actually it's one of the most dominant programs in all of college sports here in the U.S., men or women. And it took him about 10 years to figure this out from the way I understand the story. But in addition to looking for players who have all the skills and they're competitive and all this kind of stuff, he found out that there was an it factor between the person who's successful on his particular team and at Connecticut's program versus just playing college basketball anywhere else. And what he started to do when he was recruiting high school basketball players is he would watch for what it was they did, not while they were playing, but when they were called on the bench for a couple minutes, when they were typically given a breather, right? So there's two kinds of kids. He says one of them will throw a towel over their head, just get rested and get ready to be put back out on the floor. The second kid is on the edge of her seat, yelling encouragement and instructions to everyone during the game. And he said that second kid is far more rare than you think. That second kid is committed to being a great teammate. And that for Connecticut is the it factor between getting recruited to Connecticut and playing your college ball elsewhere. I think for each of us, we have to look at what is the it factor in our company. In a workshop that I actually do for companies around this, I basically put it out to the employees. What do you think is the difference between the person who makes it in this company and who doesn't? Now, as you might imagine, people who are in the room, presumably because they're good at what they do and because they are making it at the company, will, with a little bit of pride, say, hey, let me tell you what it takes to make it here, right? Let me tell you that little it factor it takes to be successful in this organization. And they'll share that. And for CEOs who have taken this program and undergone that exercise, they said that one question and the answer to that question from the employees made the whole thing worth it, because now you start getting a sense of what that it factor is. And then you start thinking, how do I interview for it? How do I assess for it? And how do I, kind of pressure test that? And at the same time, recognize and ask yourself, do I have the discipline? And maybe especially in this labor market, to say no to a person who chins the bar and looks like a really great candidate on paper, but at the same time, I know they don't quite have that it factor that makes them successful here, and being able to say no and wait and hire that really right person. So I think it's a lot of soul searching and reflecting and a lot of asking when it comes to who's successful in your company. And that's about choosing the right people for the team. And once you do, making sure that you're unlocking all of those gifts and all that talent by providing them the level of psychological safety necessary to flourish.
Yeah. Yeah. I take from that some very specifics, especially with the UConn, the it factor that really stands out to me. I would reframe it as when those young women are on the court, they are go-givers. I mean, they are go-getters.
Yeah, that was pretty good though.
Yeah.
Go-givers. They're doing that too.
and then when they're on the bench, they are go-givers. That encouragement.
There you go.
Right.
Both. Yeah.
And I don't know that there's anything universal, but I know that that's something that seems to make a really good peer group member too. I was going back to the whole small and giant kind of interplay, and Mauricio really caught it. The question I was going to ask you is, what are the qualities that are perceived when, from the inside, when feeling small? And it is that awareness, that vulnerability, that, I want my answers questioned, right? But from the outside, it's, I think, also that quality of I want my answers questioned says that that person is unafraid. That person is courageous. That person is willing to not only question themselves, but I see them being fiercely compassionate and challenging me too, right? Would you agree with that? Or
I would. I find sharing in a group experience like that and being vulnerable is a true act of not only courage but real generosity. And what it means really for everyone around that room. And that's often created by not only just the familiarity people with have one another and the level of caring there, but among other things, it's modeling really great sharing behaviors, right? So if I'm in a group and I see someone share something and not only was there no penalty for it, but they and others in the room really benefited from that. And I think conversely, great listening behaviors, right? If you think about it, it's the people in the room that really provide the safety. When they're locked in, when I see that they're really listening, they're really engaged, I feel that sense of empathy from them. That creates a much safer environment as well. So we can do a lot for one another in that regard to bring out that giant in all of us.
yeah, I was just thinking when you were saying that, yes, I feel that safety for sure. But I also, it's as if everything quiets down. And I don't know whether that's coming from the outside or coming from the inside or both, but there is that sense of just everything getting quiet and being able to see more broadly and focus more sharply at the same time. I love that. We've got another question, by the way, from
Oh yeah,
John.
I see from John. Yeah,
Yeah.
great question, by the way. One of the frameworks that I did not share, but I do quite often. In fact, I just in a recent article I wrote for CEO World, looked at this idea of a triad when it comes to a group. And it's the idea of you have the leader, you have the individual member, and you have the group itself as an entity. And all share responsibility for whatever result you want in the middle. I don't care what it is. It could be productivity, could be accountability, could how much fun you have, how much you celebrate, whatever. But everybody plays a role in that. So to answer John's question, once everyone in the group understands that this is their group and not the group leader's group, then they start recognizing that having all the voices around the table necessary to give everyone value becomes real inspiration and real, motivation for getting actively involved in making sure that they're recruiting the kind of ideal members that you're looking for. I think everybody has a hand in that, and I think it's really important. When you consider that the lion's share of the value proposition here is the people in the room, right? All that intellectual and emotional capital, all of that talent. It becomes so important that everyone gets involved in making sure that all the people seated at the table are who they need in order to have the kind of conversations that will help them learn and grow.
Yeah. I was also just kind of getting an insight here. We're talking about what any business leader can do. We probably have an audience that is very like nodding and going, yeah, I've experienced that in my peer groups. And at the same time, what we're really talking about, and we will talk in subsequent expert insights about as well, is how that can be offered down through the organization. And one of the things that I was getting while you were talking just then was the level of appreciation that we start developing for one another in a peer group, and how that creates such magic. It's not just empathy, but like deep respect and recognizing that I can actually go to somebody for something specific, or just that feeling of safety, like you talked about earlier.
I see that our good friend Rick Franzi is weighing in here with a question as well. So I want to make sure that we get to that for sure. So he's talking about this idea. There's definitely different schools of thought about the difference between sharing experiences and giving advice. So a couple things on that. When I work with groups, I basically help them try to achieve what it is they want for themselves. Every group is very different. There's definitely the school of thought from David Bradford to Stanford. There's certainly some Harvard Business Review pieces and all, which make the suggestion that by sharing advice, it can compromise psychological safety and become more about people giving the advice than about those receiving it. And I can understand that. And I think that that's an interesting point of view. The idea that when we share experiences versus give advice, then we can share those experiences in a way that people can draw from those experiences what they want in a way that's relevant for them. Do I think that in every situation, sharing experiences is always better than a group that has given one another the tacit permission to give each other advice? Not necessarily. So I would say that the research is really interesting in that regard, and I like the idea. And for most groups, sharing experiences is probably the way to go. However, there are certainly peer advisory groups out there where it is most certainly agreed upon and it becomes part of the culture of the group, so that they tend to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that can become, an issue when it comes to sharing advice. But yeah, it's kind of referred to as the Gestalt protocol, and I know EO uses it quite a bit. And back when Scott Mordell was running YPO, he was on one of the podcasts. He was on one of that Year of the Peer podcasts, and basically said that we're out of the advice giving business. And I think there's some good conversation to be had about that.
I would suspect that that could be driven easily by the presenter of the issue or the challenge saying what it is that they want. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we are at the top of the hour. This was a wonderfully informative and engaging, interactive. Thanks to all the folks in the audience, especially for the questions that gave us some additional ways to bring Leo's insights to life. We will see you again in a couple of weeks on our next Expert Insights. Just pay attention to the RAF newsletter for what's coming up. And thank you, Leo. We really appreciate you sharing this with us. We look forward to you visiting again. Yeah.
I'm delighted. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.